as we've seen, Rawls tries to justify the original position in terms of weak parameters that he puts on the initial situation to get to this most favored interpretation of the initial situation, which he calls the original position. And that's your upfront. In previous video, I discussed this. That's the upfront justification, sort of the a priori idea, like these weak constraints. These weak parameters on the initial situation to get us to the original position. You know, they've got to be, the participants have to be rational. They should be self-interest, again, to connect it with economic rational theory. They should be ignorant, etc., but veil of ignorance stuff as well. Okay, so there's that. We looked at that upfront justification, a priori stuff. So then you flip it, and then you look at the original position in terms of the judgments that would be made under the original position. And so that's the other side of that dialectic mode that of working towards, remember, the reflective equilibrium that the original position is supposed to eventually achieve. We saw this as it comes out of logic, right? Our logical laws achieve a reflective equilibrium. So this original position and its the parameters on it and the judgments from it, they too will get a kind of reflective equilibrium as well. So then the judgment justification, the a priori, or sorry, the a posteriori aspect. So for instance, here now, okay, so in this part, what we're doing now is we're looking at the judgments coming from the choosers in the original position to see if those judgments will line up, cohere, match the kinds of judgments that we normally make. Now, think about this. Rawls is going to say, look, there are certain judgments that we make, moral judgments, political justice, those kinds. There's some of them that we're sure about, that really, you know, that yeah, sure, in a philosophy class you might go, I'm not so sure about that. But in everyday life, we don't have a problem with them. And Rawls points out a couple of them. For instance, someone says to you, racial discrimination is unjust. Yes, I mean, Rawls says that's a fixed point. Like, come on, any concept of justice that's arrived at via the original position has to agree with the notion that racial discrimination is unjust, or you know, it can't say something like racial discrimination is just fine. No, it can't do that. So this idea of this judgment that racial discrimination is unjust, Rawls says that's a fixed point, and we can use that to see if our original position is justified, again, from the a posteriori angle. So even if we're okay with it over here, it still has to produce judgments that agree with these fixed points, or at least it doesn't contradict them. So Rawls is saying we can put some constraints from the other side as well. And so this would be a provisional fixed point. And they provide constraints. Now, if they didn't, if the original position led to a judgment regarding justice that conflicted with this fixed point of racial injustice is unjust, then we would racial discrimination is unjust. That is, we would then say we have to modify the original position. So the original position can be tinkered with and modified from the front end and the back end. And so that would, of course, if we modified the original position, we would ultimately modify the justice, the concept of justice that was chosen. So then there would, but it's not the case that we're always sure, right? So like that was almost an easy one to say, like racial discrimination is unjust. Like, yeah, that's not a tough one. That's pretty well kind of like a self-evident one. There would be other ones that we might not be so sure about, you know, the justice of certain things. Like, you know, we might not always be entirely sure about the distribution, say, not of fundamental rights, but the distribution of, let's say, wealth and authority. we might agree on something like, well, there should be some kind of distribution of it. Like you might be okay with saying, well, sure, you can have people that have different levels of authority or different amounts of money or something like that. But you might not be sure exactly as to what kind of distribution. So you might be unsure about the way authority is distributed through society or power or whatnot. So in that sense, we may not have fixed points like we do about the racial discrimination judgment. So this here would be areas where we might have, sometimes stronger and weaker doubts, so that it could fluctuate quite a bit. Now, what would be helpful here is if the principles of justice that come out of the original position were to maybe help alleviate some of our doubts, or create them, or maybe augment them such that we get rid of something and think of something different, so that the original position now becomes useful in providing judgments that help with the distribution. We can come to better agreements on the distribution of wealth and authority. And so in that sense, it may help remove, generally, as Rawls says, it might help remove doubts. We come to more certainty. So some of these judgments that we were maybe really unclear and uncertain about, well, the original position may help us out with that. And that's a good thing. So it's a pragmatic sense, very, very school of pragmatism here is that, yeah, it's a very useful thing to have, because it helped clear up some things for us. It got rid of some doubts regarding the application or the judgments of justice. So there's you go. There's the sort of the backhand or the a posteriori mode of the justification of the original position would be now in terms of the judgments that it produces. Now, Rawls says that he's not going to work through all of this, and he provides a nice summary. And I'm just going to kind of skim my way through pages 18 to 19, the last couple of paragraphs. So let's just kind of read through this and finish up section 4. And with that, you've got a pretty good idea of what the book is largely about, except for a bit more precision on the principles that will actually, the two principles that will be chosen by the original position. And I will get to that in the next video. So let's just sort of sum up, follow Rawls in his nice little summary that finishes off section 4. He says, in searching for the most favored description of the initial situation, we work from both ends. Okay, we've seen that. Describing it so that it represents generally shared and preferably weak conditions, right? So the ignorance and all that stuff we've imposed. And then we see if these conditions are strong enough to yield a significant set of principles, okay? If not, we look for further premises equally reasonable, and so on. In this case, there will be, but it's possible there could be discrepancies. We will have a choice. We can modify the account of the initial situation, revise existing judgments, and for even the judgments we take provisionally as fixed points, they too could be liable to revision. Now, that's a very standard thing that you find in 20th century philosophy of science post logical empiricism. So this is very much where nothing was regarded as absolutely fixed forever, but there were certain kinds of anchors that would be harder to move than others. And Rawls is very indebted in many ways to the philosophy of Quine in this book. It comes out in a number of places. So while Rawls might say there's going to be certain judgments like that one about racial discrimination, he does say it's a provisional fixed point, which it's not absolutely immutable, absolutely unchangeable in that sense, but it's pretty hard to knock it down or remove it in any way. So, but just due to the spirit of the philosophy, which is a kind of Quinean enlightened empiricism, you don't say that any statement, unless it's a purely analytic statement in logic, there would be no kinds of, and even that's problematic too if you read Quine. But anyways, there's really no such thing as an empirical statement that's going to be absolutely immune to revision in principle. But there would certainly be ones, as Quine says, that would be harder and harder, you know, like principles of logic would be harder to reformulate and to reevaluate and less likely to change than other principles. And Rawls is basically saying the same thing to a certain degree, but choices sometimes come up. By going back and forth, sometimes altering the conditions of the contractual circumstances, at others withdrawing our judgments and conforming them to principle, I assume that eventually we shall find a description of the initial situation that both expresses reasonable conditions and yields principles which match our considered judgments, duly pruned and adjusted. This state of affairs, reflective equilibrium, and that's where he uses the little footnote on the bottom of page 18 to our old friend Nelson Goodman. And Nelson Goodman, of course, was talking about inferences as well, but in justification of the principles of logic, not morality here. So it's an equilibrium because our principles and judgments coincide. It's reflective because we know to what principles our judgments conform and the premises of their derivation. So you've thought it through. And at the moment, here's a key sentence, very nicely sort of understated, and at the moment, everything is in order. But this equilibrium is not necessarily stable. It can be upset by further examination of conditions which should be imposed on the contractual situation, and by particular cases that can force us to modify and reevaluate, possibly revise our judgments. But for the time being, we have done what we can to render coherent, right? So the stuff's all fitting together, and to justify our convictions of social justice. We have reached, a conception of the original position. And then he says, I'm not going to work through that process. But we may think of the interpretation of the original position that I shall present as the result of such a hypothetical course of reflection. And he goes on to talk about, here's some good points. In arriving at the favored interpretation of the initial situation, there is no point at which an appeal is made to self-evidence in the traditional sense of either general conceptions or particular convictions. So there's no intuition or, well, that's just self-evident. No, he's not doing that. He's an empiricist, much like Quine, right? But how do we raise our confidence level? It's through agreement, right? And, trying to find the weakest kinds of most general claims we can make, and then we reinforce them through agreement and we check them. So it's a large scale application of the notion of a coherency justificationist model, which is very Quinean in the long run. Whether or not it's true, that's a much dicier issue, but we're just talking about justification here, not necessarily truth. That's a whole other issue. So I do not claim for the principles of justice, Rawls continues, propose that they are necessary truths or derivable from such truths. So he's way gone, he's moved far away from his deontological predecessor, people like Kant, and from Ross as well, because Ross, of course, did have the notion of sort of a notion of insight. But even Ross, as we've seen, does think that it is the product of a well-educated mind that can see these things. But he certainly has a stronger intuitionist bent. No matter how you spin Ross, there is more of an intuitionist bent in him, certainly than Rawls, because Rawls is nothing self-evident for Rawls, where some things grow or become to be self-evident for Ross if you're educated properly. So no necessary truths, derivable, no, none of that. A conception of justice cannot be deduced from self-evident premises or conditions on principles. Rather, its justification is an important point, page 19. Its justification is a matter of the mutual support of many considerations, of everything fitting together in one coherent view. That's very Kantian as well. Kant is a big one about things have to fit together in a large coherent framework. And remember, coherency is a stronger notion than simple lack of contradiction, because you could have a lack of contradiction in a set of propositions, but they're not coherent. Remember, coherency means they actually fit together. So if I put my, I don't know, if I put my fingers like this, right? Those are not contradicting each other, but they're not coherent. They're not really fitting together. If they actually fit snugly and overlapped and tight, that would be more coherency. Kind of a lame image, but I hope you get the point. So he's looking for a system that completely fits together, not simply a system that is free of contradiction. So those are different. Coherency model is a stronger one than just simply stronger concept than lack of contradiction. Okay, last thing, final comment. We want to say that certain principles of justice are justified because they would be agreed to in an initial situation of equality. Why should we take any interest in this if there really is never this kind of situation, this description of the original position? Perhaps he says that each aspect of the contractual situation can be given supporting ground, and what we're going to do is to gather together into one conception a number of conditions on principles that we are ready, upon due consideration, to recognize as reasonable. These constraints, they express our expectations as what's fair terms of social cooperation. And we see this original position as an expository device that sums up the meaning of these conditions and helps us to extract their consequences. And it's also an intuitive notion that suggests its own elaboration, so that led on by it, we are drawn to define more clearly the standpoint from which we can best interpret moral relationships. We need a conception that enables us to envision our objective from afar, and the intuitive notion of the original position is to do this for us. So there you go. There's the basic kind of framework. It comes really early. In the next video, I'm going to look a little bit more deeply, and the goal is to have a better idea of the two fundamental principles of justice that would be selected by the choosers in the original position.